Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Reg. As Reg mentioned, my name's Slemco. And well, you can see I've had a varied background in supply management, 16 years in transportation. I was fourth generation railroader, so I kind of came by it honestly with my great-grandfather, grandfather, and father. So there was no doubt I was going to end up somewhere within that realm. But when I finished my MBA and started a career in CN back in the 90s, I had no idea my career would evolve as it did, nor did I expect I would have learned how to operate a locomotive. So, Bobby had mentioned the importance of understanding business. I certainly learned that very early on in order to be successful, whether it was at CN or where I am now. And we use a different term at CNRL, it's called touch the steel, is you need to understand the business. In order to be a supply management professional, you need to understand what the business requirements are. So today I'm not here to talk about CNRL, which is probably more of my comfort zone. I get to talk to you about the evolution of the professionalization of supply chain management, the evolution of supply management, and then how the professional evolution has evolved with the evolution of supply management. So let's just go here for a sec. So in order to understand the evolution, we kind of have to take a look back. So I'm going to spend some time going right back to 1950. And I have to tell you, this was a bigger research project than I anticipated. I thought I understood it pretty clearly, but I had some aha moments as we went through this to try to look back where we are to where we are now and how careers have evolved. And what was interesting as I went through that exercise is my own personal career being, starting in transportation and how that evolved with how our organization, when I was at CNRL, evolved to even having a supply chain group back in late 90s. So I'll spend a little time going through there. So unfortunately, you are going to get a little bit of a 101 course with me today. And then we'll talk a little much more about how the profession has evolved based on the changing profile of the industry. And part of that's going to include, what is the discipline before? What do we need today, like traditional versus what we have? What are some of the leadership skills required today to be successful in our jobs? And this was an interesting one, the professional associations, what is available today? It is a long list. It's exploding in universities with getting supply chain courses. This isn't just buying skills anymore. This is transportation skills. It's much more integrated. So we'll talk a little bit about that so you have a flavor. And I also had some very specific ahas in that based on just what's happened in the last 5 years with professional designations and so on. And then there were some interesting facts. As I kind of went through my research, there was a survey done, it was done in the States, of 185 supply chain professionals, and I'll tell you a little bit of the findings that came out of that study, which I thought was very interesting. And in summary, we'll talk about this is where we are today, and how do we keep up with where we're going tomorrow, because the needs are ever changing. Bobby talked about, what's driving the business decisions at ATCO. A lot of those parallel exactly what we face at CNRL, and our spend, when we talk about over $6 billion spend a year, it's huge dollars when we talk about a procurement function. How do you do that effectively? You saw some passion. I have a team here at one of the tables about the challenges of balancing common sense out there with what you need to do versus policies and procedures and all those other things that come along with the job, and how does that translate into a day-to-day business model. So let's just take a step back for a moment. As you can see, it goes right back to the 1940s and 50s, and it's a very evolved discipline. So I'll take a few moments to just sort of walk through some of the history and roots from the 40s and 50s. In the 50s, logistics was thought in a military term. It had to do with procurement, maintenance, and transportation of military facilities, materials, and personnel. The value of the analytics really stemmed from the study of the logistics problems that started in the 40s as a result of the complex requirements from World War II. Focuses on how to mechanize things, how to pelletize, number of lifts, how to improve your labor processes, because everything was heavy labor, on the material handling side. How did you maximize space using racking? And it was all focused around warehouse design. The unit load concept gained popularity, and the pallet use became widespread. In the 50s, this concept extended to transportation with development of intermodal containers, together with ships, trains, and trucks to handle the containers. This was a prerequisite for supply chain globalization, which has come much later. So in terms of warehousing and materials handling, were used to describe the efforts and the activity viewed in the industrial engineering. And I guess I should have left my glasses on because I'm just going to talk to this for a sec. in the 50s, that whole unit load concept really set the stage for where we've kind of headed today. And when you talked with a lot of the oil and gas companies, I remember doing a project back with Imperial many years ago and talk about how do we unitize freight. Very focused on how we unitize. I remember someone plunking down this big textbook called The Art of Containerization. And I worked for a railway. We did containers. I thought, oh my goodness, here we go. But it was just those that continue to challenge how we look at things. And from a former CEO that I used to work with Hunter Harrison, who's over at CP now, one of the comments that will always resonate with me is, his comment was, in the time of change, experience is your worst enemy. And I think that's very true in what we do today, even with how we look and challenge with what we do in procurement, in transportation management, and materials handling. You get many other, that's the way we've always done it. Well, that's good if you want to stand still, but nothing else is standing still in our environment. So it's very important to understand some of those things as we go forward. As we move towards the 1960s, that's really the idea of supply management started forming. The practice of physical distribution and logistics emerged in the 60s and 70s with clear trend developments shifting from time-dependent freight transportation to truck rather than rail. This led to the need for more physical distribution management. Academic research, education followed this trend at that point in time and drove a fundamental paradigm shift when computers were introduced. I don't know how many of you, I remember, even in university, how many actually had a laptop. I didn't until I did a master's degree, and you went to the person's house and said, oh, they've got a computer, so we can actually get it written versus using a typewriter. Or when I worked in the railway, and everything was with the carbon copies with a typewriter. So we've evolved, and you forget how it wasn't that long ago, and how that concept, or the ability to not have manual processes, to the automation has driven our work activities in supply chain. Prior to 1960s, all transactions, record keeping were done manually. So computerization opened the door to huge opportunity for innovation in logistics planning and randomized storage to how do we optimize inventory and truck routing. We still look at today as how do you optimize trucks? I remember being at CN and we started this supply chain group in the late 90s, early 2000s. We did so much on network optimization studies, a conversion from truck to rail and rail to truck, and heaven forbid you actually said it was okay to be on truck working for a railway. So, there was a lot of advancements that have happened. That's just since, 2000 with how we look at things differently and the power of information. In the late 70s and early 80s, you saw the creation of Georgia Tech and the Production Distribution Research Center. That sort of set the stage for a lot of the educational side and how we sort of evolved from there even within Canada. In the 1980s, you can kind of coined, that's really where the logistics started coming of age. And that started the sea change in logistics with the emergence of personal computers. But the most important trend to note in the 80s that started to get huge recognition was that logistics is very expensive, very important, but also very complex. Executives started to see logistics as an area where they had the opportunity to significantly improve the bottom line. And that's still today. Now it's just expanded outwards. We're not just looking at transportation logistics, it's the entire supply chain. And it was back in the 80s when you started seeing a heavily investment from organizations with trained professionals and in new technologies. In the 90s, you can kind of coin that as that's really what started being the technology revolution. Logistics boom fueled further, emergence of enterprise resource planning, ERP systems. It wasn't that long ago we just started talking about ERPs, and even today, you look at the upgrades that are going on with even the oil and gas industry, compared to like a railway or some of the other organizations I've done work for. From an oil and gas perspective, we're still a very immature market. We're still evolving. We're still trying to get our tools up to speed to, versus just the focus on pure production. So most companies in this city in the oil and gas are all going through a major SAP upgrade right now, major Oracle upgrade. How do we integrate our systems? How do we do better demand planning? I'm sure all these things can ring true with many of you. But back in the 90s, the technology was fueling the boom. It was motivated by successes in material requirements planning systems development, and also based on the work done in the 70s and 80s, recognized the need to better link research, education, and practice. There was widespread recognition of the term supply chain. When you started in the 90s, and I guess if you do a word search, that's where when you started to actually hear people talk about supply chain. I know at CN when I was there, it wasn't until 1997 we actually formed a supply chain group. And I remember being in operations saying, I don't know what these guys are going to do. You know, they're out there talking to people. I have no idea what they're a little team of 5 people. In the end, I ended up running one of those teams later on. But it's interesting just sort of that from concept to how it got integrated into the business. And then we moved to 2000 and 2010. There's some marked changes that happened there. That's where we had the Council of Supply Chain Professionals. You talked about the proliferation of SKUs. Yeah, that's my day-to-day world today. So since the 80s, computer technology has advanced at phenomenal rates that is far ahead of the ability of actually the supply chain and logistics field to adequately utilize new technology. I remember again, back to my railway days, customers trying to figure out how do they do rail right, how do they get the right forecast, how do you integrate trucking, how do you get ocean, and there wasn't one tool, and I'm not sure there's still that tool out there today that can integrate all 3 of those to give you signals on tracking and tracing, even though you've got all this RFID technology. So we still got a ways to go. So I truly believe that comment about the technology's all there, but we haven't really got it into action yet with our day-to-day activities of how that relates to transport or to logistics planning and the supply chain overall. So going forward, technology advances are certainly going to provide tremendous value in addressing those traditional supply chain and logistics areas such as warehousing, distribution, transportation, and manufacturing and logistics. So where are we now? What's the typical supply chain look like? As supply chain management has expanded, there's some colored areas here where you see plan, make, move, deliver. Back as I mentioned, in the 40s and 50s, it was very focused on transportation, so more the move side, and then it kind of morphed into where the manufacturing. And then you get into the delivery. Just-in-time deliveries came out with the explosion of Asia and trying to get products overseas, and just some of those models. And then the whole planning side, so it's great you know when it is, but if you can't plan for when you need it, how does that fit in? So today you've got a very integrated cycle, and to me, one of the pieces that you kind of missed back in the evolution side is the sourcing piece. So you got to be able to plan well. You've got to be able to source with the right vendors, have the right relationships. You got to have the manufacturing process in place to be effective to support the demand and supply signals. Then you got to be able to move it somewhere so you get it to where you need it. And then you got to look at how you deliver it. So that's materials management. How are you running your warehouses? Are they in the right places? Is it high turn thing? These are all so integrated today, and heaven forbid you actually have to return something, or with warranties or other things. So this is the look of a typical supply chain today, and every company does some of these things well. So we're all struggling with how to do each one of these well together, and I think we've all got a little ways to go still on some of that stuff. But supply chain is expanded to include suppliers and customers along that chain. The ever-changing needs are more complex. They're much more interdependent between business environments and with the impact of globalization. There's been a shift from that whole mass production mentality to customized products, especially I know in oil and gas industry. There's greater emphasis on integration, organizational, and process flexibility. We've moved away from that pure functional enablement to strategic enablement. Metrics are certainly getting much more complex. We want better visibility across the business, and we've got different systems driving each of those things, so how do you get that so they're all talking the same language and giving you the results that you need? And it spans across operations versus the single focus that used to be back in the traditional days. So organizations are looking at their supply chains differently, and they're looking at more value chains. And I think depending on the maturity of the company and where they prioritize that, those that are ahead are starting to look at these are true value chains. And that's where you're starting to see chief procurement officers in companies. So there's a step change in the roles and responsibilities within organizations. There's still challenges that exist today. Partners don't always share the same culture, objectives, geography, the level of sophistication. So globalization has helped on one hand, but it's also led to a dispersion of supplier networks across the world. What was interesting with Bobby's presentation, in time of crisis, it's amazing what you can get done. But to some of the other comments at the table over here earlier, is living that day-to-day, not in crisis mode, is really tough when you're bounded by governance rules and responsibilities versus just getting the business done. So corporately, supply chain management has gradually been embraced as a proven managerial approach to achieving sustainable profits and driving growth. This has been accomplished primarily by focusing on the whole supply chain process to deliver the right products and services at the right quantity, to the right place, at the right time. But the difference now is with the maximum benefits. And that's one of the challenges, even within our team at CNRL, is it's great to go get a signature on a contract, but how good is it? What are we creating value for the business? Are we building the right supplier relationships? Do we have the right products at the right place at the right time? Because I tell you, I've got a big bullseye on me at the company, and they'll certainly tell me if we've shut down because we haven't had enough fuel to run our mining trucks. It's amazing the phone calls that come. And we're only as good as the planning process, and we don't own the planning process. And that's part of how you integrate across organization to make sure you got the right information at the right place at the right time. So it's not something where we just purely have our own influence over. So let's talk a little bit about the professional evolution. So we talked a little bit about how the practices happened, but what does this mean to the profession and the changing profile of what we're expecting of supply chain professionals? So just to touch base, in the 1980s with the adoption of supply chain concepts, it was really slow and incremental within organizations, within their teams. We still had a very siloed distribution with logistics, transportation departments started collaborating, but they were still very siloed back in the 80s. The academic community has lagged the industry back in the 80s and 90s, starting to catch up now, and you can see that with the amount of, because you can see the demand of professionals that we need for our industry. In the 90s, many universities created partnerships to formalize and develop new integrated supply management concepts. You had consortia at MIT, Stanford, and others leading kind of the charge on that side. So academics first described supply chain management, and they differentiated from traditional approaches. In later 90s, consulting firms, along with 50 manufacturers, formed the Supply Chain Council. That wasn't that long ago. And then when you look at, they developed the first set of cross-company metrics and approaches to track information and material flows. And that also, when we went back to the other slide about the plan, make, move, deliver, that was part of the SCORE framework that was back in the late 90s and looked at how we measured those type of operations. In the 2000s, supply chain management discipline continued and was starting to be widely adopted. In 2009, and this was a shocking date, I had lost track of this date, that's really where the new professional designation, the SCMP, was announced to replace the CPP. And I'll talk a little bit about that progression to that professional designation because I found it a really interesting one. So today, supply chain management is considered common practice in North America, Europe, and increasing in the rest of the world. So what does this all mean to the skills needed to support the evolution of supply chain management? As the profession continues to grow beyond its physical distribution routes, supply chain managers require broader expertise and deeper technical excellence and a broad understanding of business practices. The art and science of managing a global supply chain has gone through a transformation in response to changes in the way companies are operating, as well as the more complex and interdependent business environment. So practitioners, such as ourselves, need to be abreast of these developments and adopt a mix of leadership skills going forward. And I think that's one of our biggest challenges is having those leadership skills within our teams to move forward. This chart is just a little different way of looking at it. So when you looked at the 70s, very siloed with what we were looking at for the discipline. In the 80s, we moved into where we actually had logistics functions within companies. In the 90s, we actually started seeing supply chain organizations evolve within various companies, and now we're seeing those departments being more strategic enablers. So you went from technically narrow skills to much more coordination of skills. You had very localized dictatorial leadership styles back in the 70s and 80s. Coming from the railway, I'm very familiar with that. to now sparse ability to influence. And we've got to continue to be able to influence the businesses that we're working with. We're very reactive. Today, we need to be very responsive. And I say in some cases, we are still very reactive. We still need to be, but there's a difference between being reactive and responsive when you look at it. Nowadays, the profession is being asked to anticipate competitive challenges, obstacles, and opportunities. It's not just showing up and buying something. We've got to be able to anticipate. I tell you, I wish my glass ball was bigger some days because if I could have had more foresight that the changing plan that we're going to need this reactor or this and that in case something happens, or the ability to actually identify critical spares, that would make our lives much easier. But with the move away from functional towards strategy enablement requires supply chain managers to adopt new skills, technology, metrics, risk management discipline needed to fulfill those new roles. So let's consider some of the range and types of skills supply chain leaders need to be functional supply chain compared to those required with more strategic regimes. So a traditional supply chain leader were functional experts in the past. Today, much more critical. The technical competence. Today, we need tools to optimize critical components and focus on visibility and coordination aspects in the flow of data. So we get into the real specifics about what we need with our people within our teams versus what we had previously, which was much more tactical, the traditional side, communication, functional experts, technically narrow focus. You had transportation, you ran trucks, or you ran warehouses, but usually the two didn't necessarily combine. There's low incentive to actually cross functions and work with other departments. Information was hoarded. Heaven forbid you exposed another department with what was going on. So, information was power for some back in the days, and that wasn't too long ago from some of my history. Technical competence, dominant technology used in localized and isolated optimization tools. Transportation warehouse management, production planning, optimized based on decisions. You had narrow business perspective. You started seeing some subject matter experts in specific silos, like you had transportation managers, you had warehouse, but they weren't integrated to the extent we are today or expecting today. The ability to influence, your circle of influence, local and controlled, is very hierarchical. Leaders, very dictatorial, and it could be a very adversarial position back in the day. So today, the roles are much more strategic. And people in these roles need to be able to manage people and be people leaders. So I think Bobby had mentioned, people, process, technology, those are key. And we're only as good as our people. Critical skills, it's coordination excellence. Today, it's not about working in just your little umbrella. It's the ability to coordinate across functions, across operations, across suppliers. The expectations are far higher than what they used to be. All decisions impacted or are impacted by other aspects of supply chain. I always think of it as like an elastic band triangle. You got price, quality, and service. You push on one, you're usually giving up something else. So the trick is to try to get that equally expanding and contracting is a really tricky thing to do. The flow of data, we need to have better flows of data, better integration of data to make better business decisions and also be able to forecast, to be able to respond. We need experts with specialist knowledge, but also with broad business perspectives. I think one of the biggest things I learned was being able to be work boots on the ground, learning the business, so you could challenge the right decisions. And I think that's part of the challenge, working now for an oil and gas company, because I don't come from oil and gas roots, is I don't have that same ability yet to be able to challenge back to the business when they say, we just can't change suppliers because there's a risk associated. Sometimes there's just a comfort zone. So how do you break down those barriers to be able to challenge what's doing right for the business versus common sense? So those are things as we continue to build our skill sets out within my team and within the organization to get out of those comfort zones when it's still low risk. Circle of influence, the reach exceeds just the supply chain organization. It's not only internal, across departments, across functions, across IT, legal, marketing, it's right across the board, but also within other organizations. I look at the touch points, especially with our spend, it's tremendous. The amount of suppliers that we have out there that we've got to build relationships with versus just getting a price, that's a huge task. Leaders are required to influence behavior across the supply chain, so this is being more of a strategic enabler. Getting the credibility internally, so you're listened to, and it's like, yeah, I know those guys over there. They're doing a bunch of stuff on procurement. If we need a contract, we'll go to them. But really understanding the true value that your department can bring. And collaborative, it's still a very maturing area. There's still lots of work to be done to how we collaborate internally as well as externally. So 10 years ago, supply chain professionals were logistics oriented, and their skill set did include technical proficiency in discrete areas, knowledge of shipping routes, familiarity with warehousing, equipment, distribution center locations and footprints, with a solid grasp of freight rates and fuel costs. Professionals today still need to be experts at managing those things, but they also have to be managing supply chain functions such as transportation, warehousing, inventory management, production planning, but the supply chain process extends end to end now, and even outside the firm, as I was mentioning. So the competencies today include global orientation, systems thinking. We need to have at minimum an understanding of business continuity basis, as well as the organized business continuity approach and strategies. And I think we heard that really clearly through Bobby's presentation, that we need to understand that. And it's okay for guys to go buy stuff out there. We're not going to prohibit them from doing that if it's the right thing to do for a business. But there's still got to be some governing principles for how we operate so we don't have that leakage of spend and other things as we go forward. Before I get to that, one of the things I just wanted to mention, because I know this is a Women in Supply Chain conference, and we do a lot of hiring. We've got a large team, a lot of interviewing. What's nice is I've got a really good diversity between women and men within our team. But when we're actually posting jobs, and there was a recent article by Patricia Moser that stated, and I thought this really resonated with me because I see it when I'm interviewing people, that when women are looking at when they're considering applying for a job, they feel, or we feel, that we need to have 100% of those skill sets before we'll actually apply for a job. The difference is, men only think, hey, I got half or 67%, I'm good. And you know what? That is translated to, I think, of the numerous amount of interviewing I've done over my career, and even with my own, challenges or how I challenge myself. To stretch you outside of your comfort zone, I think sometimes we are, as Bobby mentioned, our own worst enemies. And doesn't mean you're not capable, and just having some of those foundational principles, you can still go do the job. But there is a fundamental difference there, and I think that statistic is very true, and I see it in practice daily. I've got people who are analysts who think they're ready for managers' jobs, and I can tell you what gender they are, typically. And you know what? But good on them. They're trying. You can have a business conversation about it, but I think it's just a really important point as we're sitting here in this forum today to bring up that statistic. Okay, back to some of the 101 stuff. Professional associations, what's available today? I was shocked by the amount. Like, you participate in over the years, you see a bunch of the organizations, you participate in a lot of the associations, but there's a lot out there across North America. Like, some of these are very US-centric as well, but we've got the PMAC, which I'm going to talk a little bit more, and I think our next speaker is going to be speaking, or is from the Purchasing Management Association of Canada. We've got the Canadian Supply Chain Sector. We've got the Supply Chain Logistics Association of Canada, the SCL, and you've got the different chapters. And then you've got all these other institutes. So supply chain professionals can attain a professional certification by means of certification exam developed by a third party, usually a nonprofit, certification only. But that's changing now. Now we've got all these university programs. And I know I've sat on the Mount Royal Advisory Board for the last 7-8 years, and it's even evolved. Now it's a university, it's not just a diploma. And we're seeing a lot of, the universities are ramping up, so it's not just the professional associations, we're actually getting degrees in supply chain, and with majors, not just minors. So it's moving along. There's several certification programs. There's the APICS, the Association for Operations Management, you've got the Educational Alliance, you've got the Institute of Supply Management. So it goes on and on, but the Purchasing Management Association of Canada is the main certifying body for Canada, with the designations having global reciprocity. The designations of Supply Chain Management Professional, SCMP, is the main designation, with several others that progress towards the SCMP. This just shows you a bunch of skills. I don't expect you guys to be able to read it very well from there. But what was interesting about this chart, and I thought, the reason why I included it is when you actually look at the competencies that are aligned across here, procurement, storage, strategic sourcing, new product development, production, Lean Six Sigma, inventory management, materials management, network design, transportation, demand planning, integrated supply chain, risk management, project management, leadership, people management, technology, theory of constraints, operations, and accounting. You look how vast our industry is and the skill sets that are needed. I always found it interesting when I went to do some round table rapid fire interviewing with some of the university students. They say, I just want to be this. Like, wow, you're closing yourself off because there's just so much out there. To have that preconceived notion that you only want to be a buyer when you could get into strategic sourcing and there's still a buying principle to it. But don't narrow your opportunities by, especially when you're doing cover letters, and say, this is what I want to be when the market's this big. So I just thought that was an interesting one with just the level of competencies needed for the jobs that we have today. So the path to a supply management professional designation, I'm just going to touch on this because I thought it was really interesting looking at the history because I didn't really fully understand it before. You know, we've talked about it the last 10 years. I've got a lot of my staff that are working towards their designation. But it started all back in 1919 with the National Association of Purchasing Agents, a U.S. association that opened its first Canadian chapter in Montreal, long time ago. I was actually shocked by that date. When you kind of look forward to, in 1966, the first 6 professional purchasing designations happened, and they're by oral presentations. In 1969, the name was changed to PMAC in recognition of the fact that practitioners now identified as a professional purchasing manager. In 1985, it embarked on a province-by-province process to provincially certify professional designation of CPP, so the Certified Purchasing, Professional Purchasing. That's not that long ago. And then when you looked at, in 1996 is actually when we went to written exams versus oral. In 2005, PMAC redefined the field of practice from purchasing to a more comprehensive strategic supply chain management to recognize the broader scope and growing influence of the profession. And you can see based on that initial evolution chart that I gave you, how the skills were changing and how that is now being reflected, but it's taken, you know, to the 2000s to expand some of that educational requirements. 2007, Supply Chain Management Leadership Program launches a path to professional accreditation. Competency-based program with advanced supply management knowledge and high-level business skills. So not just being a supply management person, it's kind of like MBAs for engineers. You know, how do you get those broader business skills on top of your supply chain skills? And then in 2009, I had mentioned this date before, is really where the new professional designation came into play. That's only 3-4 years ago. So it'll be interesting to see 2, 3, 5 years down the road what that looks like and how that's going to shape even the skill sets we have within our teams. But now that designation does it's much more strategic, it's global, and it's also showing integrated thinking. So I mentioned earlier there's a study that was done out of 185 professionals, predominantly in the States, but people working in the field at the higher levels within their field. But out of some of these categories, I thought it was sort of noteworthy. So on the education side, 90% of those professionals were university graduates. The most common degree was a bachelor's degree in business. 57% were business degrees. 15%, the next tier down was 15% in engineering. Then there's 11% in actual logistics, but that's reflective of just where the programs are within universities, in my opinion. And then 10% is for liberal arts. But out of those 185 surveyed, half of them had master's degrees. I was shocked by that statistic. Courses and classes deemed most helpful that were identified through the thing, there was a ranking. The top one being obviously supply chain, logistics, management, and strategies. Finance and accounting came next, and then international global supply chain work. And out of the professionals also interviewed, 2 out of 3 were actively affiliated with a supply chain association. Some of the knowledge and skill sets valued for entering the field: 1, negotiation skills and business knowledge. People skills and communication, very high up there. It is a people industry. Supply chain logistics experience, and then finance and the analytical skills that followed. So in summary, you know, you can see it is very much an evolving discipline. The art and science of managing end-to-end global supply chains has gone through major transformations in response to how companies operate along the increased complexity and the interdependent business environments in which we work. All of us in the field need to keep pace with the skills needed to be successful in the ever-changing discipline. We need to keep pace with new developments and adopt the right mix of leadership skills. It's almost impossible to predict what leadership capabilities will be needed going forward. So we need to be agile, flexible, ready to respond, and also We each need to be building our own leadership styles, but also our leadership pipeline within our organizations. I'll leave you with a few other views that were just recently out just this last week from Pricewaterhouse's annual Global CEO survey. And it showed the continued focus on supply chain. So these were the results of CEOs that were interviewed, and they're still reluctant to abandon cost-cutting initiatives until the economy shows further signs of strengthening. 81% of these CEOs are implementing cost-cutting initiatives. They did it in 2012, and 71% are still going to continue down that path in 2013. 44 are investing in increase the operational effectiveness of their company. 53 plan to strengthen the engagement with key suppliers to minimize costs and maximize supply chain flexibility and deliver performance. That's half. So that just shows the ongoing challenges that we have within our departments and running supply chain departments. Global industries are focused on supply chain engagements, which include, so the industries most focused is the industrial manufacturing, consumer goods, energy, oil and gas, and technology. 43% say we will see more shifts in consumer spending behavior. 41% concerned with energy and raw material costs. That's near and dear to my heart. 43% on sustainable supply chains. You're hearing more and more. There's been always a lot of talk. I know when I was consulting at Ernst & Young, this whole how to have more environmental supply chains, tax-efficient supply chains. So there's continued focus on reducing environmental footprints. Companies are continuing to become desired key suppliers, emphasis on not price, but service for long-term growth. Businesses are looking for opportunities for innovation and competitive advantage in their operating model to offer customers more and do it at a lower cost. So what does this mean? Good news for all of us in the industry. Supply chain is working its way up the command ladder in North America. If you like change and you're adaptable as a leader, as also within your own roles, you're going to excel and you'll probably be rewarded. You heard the statistic Peter mentioned early on about the hundreds of thousands of jobs coming. And you go on any website, I certainly know in the oil and gas industry today, and look at procurement jobs. We all have, I would say anyway, 30 plus postings per company. It is just an exploding area for us, and it's tough to keep up, to keep those skill sets. Traditionally, you end up inheriting people in supply chain that didn't really know what it was and whether they wanted to be. Now we're trying to get how do you get the professionals, people who want to be in these jobs, that have a passion to be in these jobs, are going to challenge the way we think and challenge the way we do things so that we can evolve and match those needs from the business perspective. And the last comment I'll just leave you with, and I think Bobby has sort of alluded to a lot of this stuff too, and this was said to me a long time ago, is managers do things right, leaders do the right thing. And I think that really parallels the challenges we have in supply chain and how we fit within the organization. We can't just do it right, we've got to continue to do the right things for the business. Thank you.